Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
We're going to talk to Gina again in a minute, but first of all, Nigel Farage's greatest moment was, of course, the Brexit referendum result. But now, looking at what's been going on in the courts and at Westminster, he is already talking of the great betrayal. And he joins me now. Mr. Farage, do you really think that Brexit won't happen as things stand?
Oh, I hope and pray that it does, but what I see is a movement, and this court case is just a part of it. There's a movement to try and keep us in the single market. Now, we've seen Jeremy Corbyn, Ed Miliband, Nick Clegg, even some Tory backbenchers who were on the Leave side are now arguing, well, of course, Britain must stay part of the single market. And frankly, if that's where we end up, we've got half Brexit, and that's not what we voted for.
You've said this week that you don't any longer trust the independence of the judges. That seems a very hardline thing to say, a bit Trumpy, if I may say.
Isn't it? I mean, isn't it ever? But then you look at Lord Justice Thomas, and you see that actually he was the founding member of a body seeking to integrate law at an EU level. Surely with that background, he should have absented himself from this particular case.
So do you think that when it comes to the Supreme Court, we shouldn't trust the Supreme Court not to be politically biased in this decision? Is that what you're saying?
I'm afraid that the reach of the European Union into the upper echelons of society in this country makes it quite difficult for us to trust the judgments. And I mean, look, if you were on a jury, you would have to say, I have a vested interest in this case, I can't sit on this jury. I'd like the same thing to happen.
But given that all law has involved European law, that would virtually rule out all judges. And I just put it to you that these are professionals whose job is to look at our constitutional law and take a decision on the basis of the law.
That's fine.
It's quite dangerous to call them.
That's fine, but if they've been activists pushing for politically European integration, they shouldn't be making these judgments.
When it comes to those famous newspaper headlines now, enemies of the people, do you deprecate that or do you agree with it?
Oh, well, I completely understand. But look, let's get to what's happening here. We may have seen Bob Geldof and 40,000 people in Parliament Square, moaning about Brexit. Believe you me, if the people in this country think that they're going to be cheated, they're going to be betrayed, then we will see political anger, the likes of which none of us in our lifetimes have ever witnessed in this country. Those newspaper headlines are reflecting that.
There's going to be a real danger of disturbance in the streets and so on if Brexit is thwarted by Parliament.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I heard you talking to Gina Miller earlier about the nasty things that have been said about her. I mean, believe you me, I've had years of this. I've had years of hate mobs, taxpayer-funded hate mobs, chasing me around Britain. The temperature of this is very, very high. Now, I'm going to say to everybody watching this who was on the Brexit side, let's try and get even. Let's have peaceful protest, and let's make sure in any form of election we don't support people who want to overturn this process.
Now, you mentioned election. We've got a by-election coming up in Lincolnshire.
Yeah.
The Conservatives are almost bound, I'd have thought, to choose a kind of fairly hard Brexit candidate. In those circumstances, what is the role of UKIP?
Well, the point about UKIP is that we have to make sure this actually happens, and history is littered with politicians making big promises and not delivering. In fact, I can remember when she was Home Secretary, Theresa May making big promises about what she would do with immigration numbers and failing at every turn.
You've said in the Sunday Express today that you're not going off to the jungle, you're not going to be nibbling on kangaroos' nether parts or anything like that. You're going to stay and fight because it's politically very important, so you're not giving up on politics.
No.
Can I ask you about your own future? Because, if I may say so gently, your party has had a bit of a leadership issue recently. I assume you're now a Paul Nuttall man, but it's been a complete something.
No, it's been a soap opera. Yeah. Look, we've had a terrible few weeks. There's no question about that. It's been awful. It's been pretty embarrassing at times. And yet, in the opinion polls, there is still a significant level of support for us out there. And I think...
Can you see circumstances in which, before Brexit actually happens, you come back to lead UKIP? No? No,
I've had enough of party politics. I'm sick of it. I'm interested in politics, interested in issues, keen to go on campaigning, but party politics, preparing a party for national elections every year, finished.
All right, we're going to talk more about politics in a moment, but let's try and warm things up again. Nigel Farage, you have talked about a moneyed elite betraying the will of the people. Are you talking about Gina here, Miller?
Oh, very much so, yeah. Although, don't forget, I've been in the European Parliament for years, so I've seen this happen all over Europe. I've seen the Danes forced to vote again, the Irish forced to vote again, the Dutch and French ignored. There is a political and wealthy ruling elite who are not prepared to accept the democratic result of referendums.
You've been an insurgent all your political life. Do you not at least admire Gina Miller here for using her own money to change things? I mean, nobody asked her to do this. She used her own money. She went to the House of Lords, she went to the courts, and she has now changed our entire political structure.
Well, Parliament has to have a vote, and she's done what she believes in. I, of course, support people doing what they believe in. However, I just want to ask her, what part of the word leave don't you understand?
This case, have you read the case?
Yes, and you're arguing
Yes.
that Parliament should have a say. But do you want us, ultimately, OK, you accept we're leaving the European Union, do you want us to stay part of the single market?
That is not, I'm not the politician. I'm not the politician here. I'm the person who saw the elephant in the room, which was there is no legal certainty. You should actually be my biggest fan, because I've just created the legal certainty so that Theresa May can now, rather than appealing, go ahead, have the debate and leave, not interrupt her timetable. So actually, there is legal certainty.
But what you've done is you've given all those in Parliament who argue that the referendum does not mean we should leave the single market, you've given them the chance, effectively, to overturn the Prime Minister's wish and to mandate her. And if that happens, you would have stirred up, I think, the biggest political upset we've ever seen.
So should we sack all the MPs and they go home? Because
what do
we
you know
have
what?
a representative democracy at the moment, which means that they have to go in there and debate. That's what Parliament was. That's what you argued for the whole way through,
I've argued
which was
for
parliamentary sovereignty.
No,
Exactly.
I don't. No. This is not about whether Parliament's sovereign. It's about whether the British people are sovereign. That's the real
Well, we are
argument
not a
here.
direct
and for you, as a pro-EU supporter,
representative.
to talk about parliamentary sovereignty in Britain is a bit rich, isn't it? Really.
Will we move on? Do you want a country where we have no process, where everything we do in life, be it buying a house...
It's called a referendum. We've had a referendum.
If Parliament wanted to, the Referendum Act would not have said it was advisory. The politicians lied all the way through, because they didn't say that.
I take the advisory point, and I would now wish to see constitutional change to make referendums binding, and that then would end this argument and there'd be no need for this case.
Do you think there now needs to be another general... If Brexit is sort of stuck inside the House of Commons and the House of Lords, we haven't even talked about the Lords for a while, do you think there needs to be another general election?
Yes, I think that if Parliament was to effectively try and mandate the Prime Minister to try and keep us inside the single market, I don't think Theresa May would have any choice but to go to the country for a spring general election, and she could do so on a very clear ticket, win a big majority. The House of Lords problem, there are 104 Liberal Democrat live peers who appear to be pledged to delaying the process as much as possible.
And some
this could be
Conservative peers as well.
I mean, this could be the end of the House of Lords. Yeah.
Seriously, so you're stirring up huge things here, Gina Miller.
I think that Nigel's point on referendum and where is the place of referendum in our political system is a very valid one. But that's not where we exist now. It's about the rule of law where we are now. That is a very valid point about the whole political system being looked at, because it all needs changing, and that's the hatred that's really there. And that's a hatred I completely understand in the people, is that nobody trusts the politicians because the majority of the ones who are the main decision makers lie.
But we always used to trust the judges, and apparently we don't trust the judges now either.
I think that is unforgivable, because they are not, I'm a nobody. They are the biggest brains in this country. They are what make us great. And then, no, I'm sorry, but the reason you said earlier about being conflicted, well, we were part of the European Union. Of course they have to talk about European law. We haven't left yet.
Yes,
they
but
have
Lord
to.
Thomas has been an activist for integration of law at EU level. And I look, the points of law we can argue forever. I just feel that if somebody is directly politically conflicted by their past, they should not sit in judgment. That's all.
Well, thank you both very much. I'm just slightly crestfallen. The best bits of the programme are where I'm not involved at all. But thanks very much for that discussion.
I'm delighted to be joined by the leader of the House of Commons, and I think you were the longest-serving Europe minister, weren't you?
Yeah, for my sins,
David.
Yep.
So, I read the judgment by the High Court judges, which said that Parliament ultimately has to have a say before the Prime Minister presses the Article 50 negotiation button. That's the moment when we formally leave the EU or notify our intention to leave the EU, a notification that is pretty much irreversible. Given that the judgment was so clear, why is Theresa May appealing it?
Because the judgment raised some important constitutional questions that I think it's right we put before the Supreme Court. I mean,
What's the basis? What will be the basis of her case?
I don't want to sort of prejudge what the Attorney General and his team are going to argue before the Supreme Court, but to give you one illustration of that, Robert, Parliament could, if it wanted, in 2008, when the Lisbon Treaty was written into the law, have written in that you had to go back to the House of Commons for a new Act of Parliament before any government could trigger Article 50. In 2011, Parliament did introduce that kind of lock, a requirement for primary legislation, on a whole range of other treaty articles in Lisbon before a British government could use them. For example, to take the UK into the euro and end our opt-out. Parliament said, no, you can't do that. You've got to have not just an Act of Parliament, but also a referendum there. Now, Parliament chose not at that time, either in 2008 or 2011, to put such a requirement on in respect of the government's power to trigger Article 50. So the judges in the High Court have come to a novel interpretation of how you read Parliament's intention, given what's happened with other articles. That's one argument that we will be putting forward, but there will be others too. And you know, the government's been very calm and clear about this. We disagree with the judges. We accept the High Court has the right to interpret the law as Parliament has enacted it, but we have the right to go to the Court of Appeal, in this case to the Supreme Court, and argue that the court that heard it first time round got it wrong. You
were a passionate campaigner for Remain during the referendum. Were you not secretly a bit pleased by the High Court judgment?
No, because I mean, I'm a Democrat. And,
but as a Democrat, surely you want... I mean, and also, you know, apart from the Speaker, I mean, your role is more to serve MPs in the House of Commons than any other member of the House of Commons. Surely you were thrilled that MPs' power has been confirmed.
MPs exercised that power when they passed by 6-1 a referendum bill, and I said at the dispatch box, both Conservative and Labour spokesmen said at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, in enacting the referendum law, we are giving the final say to the British people. And at that time, everybody accepted that while, in strict legal terms, you could say the referendum was advisory, not legally binding, that we all accepted it was politically binding on the government of the day and on Parliament. And I think you talk to, you know, honourable Labour MPs, Hilary Benn and the like, who also, like me, supported Remain passionately during the referendum campaign, say, well, you know, it was a big turnout, 70% or so. It was a narrow majority, but a decisive majority in favour of leaving. So just as you accept a general election result that goes against you, so you've got to accept the referendum result. And what's in the British national interest is to get
the Prime Minister, with just a few hours to go before her trip to India, said that she does not want Parliament to bind her hands if, in the end, the Supreme Court rules in the way of the High Court judges and says Parliament has to have a vote. What's all that about?
That Parliament has enacted the referendum. Parliament, at the end of the day, will almost certainly have to agree to the terms of an exit deal, because there are laws governing the fact that treaties have to be placed before Parliament.
But that's many years.
But what would be a gross mistake and harm our national interest would be for the government to be required to spell out every detail, red lines of our negotiating position.
But why not spell out in a white paper the broad principles of what she wants to achieve?
We have been already spelling out those principles.
Not very much, frankly. We don't know whether we're in the single market or not. We don't know if we're going to be in the customs union or not. David, I mean, you know more about this than almost anybody. We've had no important detail.
We are saying, Robert, already that we will be seeking the maximum access to the single market and freedom to operate within the single market for British companies.
What does that mean in practice, though? Does that mean a whole series of trade deals?
We're saying that freedom of movement can't go on as it is now, but that we want to safeguard the rights of British citizens elsewhere in Europe and European citizens who are already here lawfully.
But again,
continue the police and judicial cooperation that's working so well against crime and terrorism on a European scale. Those are important high-level objectives. Now, what the government's doing...
so high as to be almost meaningless.
What the government is doing at the moment is discussing with British business, with other interest groups that will be affected, precisely the kind of detail that you're pressing me over now. Exactly what form do they think a new agreement would best take? What are the key...
But will MPs have the ability to debate and give, in a sense, a view on these things?
I think even you are going to find yourself more than sated in terms of the debate. We've got a debate tomorrow in the House of Commons.
But will they be able to influence the actual negotiations, or is Theresa May simply looking for a blank cheque in the form of a one-line bill?
Ministers always listen to what is said in Parliament when MPs are speaking with knowledge and good judgment on behalf of...
And what about Cabinet? Will Cabinet also have a role?
And Cabinet has already discussed these matters. What would be wrong...
Do you get the sense that Theresa May is listening to Cabinet?
Theresa, in my experience, Theresa has been allowing enormous scope for discussion within Cabinet. Nobody's felt shy of coming forward and expressing their view around the Cabinet table. That's exactly how it should be. What would be crazy would be to send a British negotiator off to Brussels to sit opposite spokesmen for 27 other countries. We have declared...
So it will be...
But they haven't.
But can I just check one thing? Because you must... You are in a privileged position on this. You must know the answer to this question. It will be... If the Supreme Court goes the way of the High Court judges, it will be a one-line bill, basically giving her the right to trigger Article 50.
Well, I'm not going to speculate on the outcome of the Supreme Court decision. We're obviously...
No, but I'm saying if. I'm not asking you to... But you've got a plan for it.
But we will... obey the law. I mean, it is written into the Ministerial Code and the Civil Service Code that governments conform with the law. So if the judgment goes against us, clearly we will have
a one-line bill.
That judgment is. That's taking me into territory that I'm not prepared to speculate on. But
can you get the relevant legislation through Parliament by her end of March deadline?
I think that most MPs, however we voted and campaigned during the referendum, accept that the judgment of the British people as a whole is politically binding. And I think I'm hearing that from Labour colleagues as much as from Conservatives, and whether people supported in or out in the referendum.
And the bashing up of the judges who made the decision, how do you feel about that?
I think that the judges ought to be respected. As a Foreign Office Minister, I talk to enough people from countries that don't have independent courts to know how important that is. But freedom of the press is important, and, the press is sometimes offensive to people.
Has the Lord Chancellor, Liz Truss, stood up and made enough of a statement about the importance of the judiciary, the independence of the judiciary?
Liz was very clear yesterday about the importance,
why does the Bar Council think she's not? Why does the Bar Council think she wasn't clear enough?
Well, that's for the Bar Council to explain. But I think there's a danger of actually exaggerating this. In my experience of judges, they're pretty formidable characters. These are tough old birds. They're not going to lose sleep over a disobliging headline in a tabloid. Come on.
David Livingston, I'm immensely grateful for you joining us this morning. In a moment, I'll be speaking to a Tory who's had more big jobs, I think, than Jose Mourinho even. It's Chris Patton. But first, Allegra, how has our viewer reacted to David Liddington?
So our one viewer taking issue, actually, not with Liddington, but with the Leave campaigners' position. You'll remember earlier we showed you a tweet, Leave campaigners suggesting that if people are unhappy, they should put a government leaflet passage on the side of the High Court. This guy here saying, have to say, not entirely convinced that an election leaflet can overrule a High Court ruling. Could be wrong, though. Anyway, there we are. But look, some stats and graphs for our next guest, Chris Patton, who, as Chancellor of Oxford University, may well be familiar with the following. So, first pie chart is how much of our academic staff comes from the European Union. It's a lot. It's 16%, over 30,000. Britain could be dumber after Brexit. But then look at this. This is not quite so gloomy. Of our university funding, just 2.5% comes from the EU. If we get lots of American and Commonwealth academics instead, could we muddle through? Robert.
I'm delighted to be joined by Lord Patton, former chairman of the Tory party. Now,
those were the days.
Those were the glorious days. Win an
Happy
election,
days.
lose your seat, as I remember. The Prime Minister put out a statement just a few hours ago basically saying to MPs and Lords, don't bind my hands in these Brexit negotiations. What's the point there for a parliamentary debate if you can't influence the negotiation?
Well, I don't think that Parliament will bind her hands. But I think Parliament has a legitimate interest, as has the boss of Nissan, in what the government mean by Brexit. I suspect they may not know.
If she puts, which, although David Lidington, and I said it properly this time, if David Lidington ultimately does put a one-line bill to MPs and Lords, which basically says, we approve the triggering of Article 50. Everybody thinks that's what the government wants to do.
There'll still be a debate. There'll still be a debate about what it means.
There'll be a debate, but do you think that MPs or indeed Lords should try and amend that bill to say, well, trigger Article 50, but we've got to be members of the single market, or they've got to be this version of control of immigration?
I very much doubt that. What I think we should do...
You wouldn't want that? You wouldn't want the House to do that?
I think the House should ask tough questions about what Brexit means, because we still don't know. But I think it has to be very cautious about going further than that. What's happened in the past? Let me just be clear what's happened in the past. When Theresa May was Home Secretary, she used the Lisbon Treaty, Protocol 36 of the Lisbon Treaty, to get us out of a number of justice and home affairs rules that we'd previously applied. She's told Parliament what she wanted to do. She went to Parliament saying what she wanted to get us out of. She then went and negotiated that in Brussels. She then came back to Parliament, reported what she'd done, and got agreement for it. Now, I don't know why that was sensible to do about justice and home affairs and not to do across the board. It's the way we work.
She seems to think that she'll get a much worse economic deal if she works on that basis.
No, to be frank, I'm not sure that they know what they want. Maybe they're waiting for Dan Hannam to tell them. He probably has a better idea than some of them. I think part of the problem is that they don't want to say too much, because they're trying to hold together a pretty dodgy coalition of people who are most concerned about immigration, unlike Dan, people who are most concerned about free trade or protectionism. And the more explicit they are, the more danger there is of this pretty rickety coalition starting to fall to pieces. And I think that's understandable, but it's not very credible.
Now, this attack on the High Court judges, how did you feel when you saw, for example, the Mail front page describing him as the enemy of the people, and Nigel Farage, and indeed some Tory MPs, including
a cabinet minister,
including a cabinet minister. Exactly.
Should have been out in his ear.
Yeah.
Look.
So you think in a major government, Sajid Javid would have been seriously ticked off?
I think there'd have been quite a lot of us who would have been very reluctant to sit around a cabinet table with him. Theresa May is a brave and decent woman. Yep. She made her reputation in politics by condemning the Conservative Party for looking like the nasty party. Here we are with a debate in this country which is starting to make us look mean and a bit nasty. The sort of things that Dominic Grieve, who's a very sensible, level-headed former Attorney General, was saying the other day, are alas true. Theresa May should make it absolutely clear that she doesn't like the way that tabloid editors have been pushing this debate, that we actually need to behave more decently to one another and with a great deal more respect, as a couple of bishops have been saying. It's for Theresa May to give that sort of leadership.
But just to be clear, you think that should have been... I mean, Sajid Javid should be sacked, effectively.
I certainly don't think he should say... If he doesn't know what the rule of law means in politics... Look, I used to have his job. When I was negotiating with the Chinese over Hong Kong, I remember trying to explain to my opposite number what the rule of law meant. And I said to him, look, when I was a cabinet minister, the courts would occasionally turn down things which I'd decided, and I had to accept it. And this Chinese bureaucrat thought I was kidding him, thought I was pulling his leg. But that's what the rule of law actually means. Parliament is supreme. The courts can actually intervene when they think the executive has made a mistake. I thought that's what this referendum, which I was on the losing side of, and that's a fact, that's happened, was all about.
Now, you do seem to imply that Brexit for you does mean Brexit and you won't be trying to reverse that decision. But on the other hand, you also think that the impact of leaving the EU on one of your current responsibilities, which is Chancellor of Oxford University, is terrible, don't you?
Yeah. My overall view on Brexit is the same as Theresa May's was when she made that speech to Goldman Sachs off the record during the referendum.
Yeah.
I think it's bad for us. I think it's particularly bad for our universities. We have, despite the fact that no governments have behaved particularly well towards universities over the last few years, we have the second best higher education system in the world. We have some
and
of the
Oxford is ranked number one, isn't it?
Oxford is ranked number one.
Can you keep that status after we leave the EU? Because you get a ton of money from the EU, don't you?
Yeah, but there is money involved. But the most important thing is the collaboration with research.
Right.
Is our ability to attract people from America.
Are you finding it
Europe.
harder to recruit at the moment?
Well, I think it will be very difficult. It would be more difficult to recruit people if they're told that they shouldn't appear to be world citizens, that you can't be a citizen of anything except your own country, which was a rather unfortunate sentence which Mrs May used in her conference speech. All of us, I think, have said in the past things to Conservative Party conferences we rather regret, done it myself. So I don't necessarily hold that against her. But
what about this idea that's being floated that, it looks as though Theresa May does want to introduce new restrictions on foreign students coming here. But there is this idea that somehow there'll be special privileges for Russell Group universities. It'll be easier for universities like Oxford to get foreign students than from other universities. Does that make sense?
No, I mean, she's going to find a lot of her time in India in the next 2 or 3 days spent talking about our restrictions on Indian students coming to here. I would be
They're
much more convinced. They are very worried. I would be much more convinced that we were really serious about Brexit, meaning still being open to the world, if we weren't trying to close off opportunities for young people to come here. Those numbers have been falling for years, and we don't have to do it. Even UKIP thinks we should take students out of the immigration figures. Enoch Powell thought that students shouldn't be in the immigration figures all those years ago. If you take the OECD categorization of immigration, you don't put students in the figures. So
she's just got to give up this idea.
I fear that the government and the Prime Minister have painted themselves unnecessarily into a corner, and it would be much more helpful to the overall argument about still having a decent relationship with Europe and others after Brexit if we would get off this hook we've put ourselves on.
Lord Patton, many thanks
you very
indeed. So now I'm over to see my lovely group of chums, and it probably won't surprise you that I'm going to start with Daniel Hannam, MEP. Lord Patton says, more or less, that the Communities Secretary, Sajid Javid, should be sacked for attacking those judges who made that judgment, saying Parliament has to have the final say on whether we trigger Article 50. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree with that. I mean, being a free society, of course, means that judges are independent and will sometimes, as Lord Patton rightly says, overrule the executive. It doesn't then mean that they should be immune to criticism. All of us should be open to criticism, and sometimes that criticism will be excessive. And then we can all criticise the critics. I mean, that's what an open society is.
I mean, you've sort of criticised them already, haven't you?
I think, as a matter of point of law, it was a very odd decision because every previous ruling about this, when we joined the EU in the first place, Maastricht, Lisbon, it was always done on the basis of executive action followed by a parliamentary vote. And by the way, there's no one is questioning that Parliament will vote on this. The only issue is whether Parliament should stop the whole
process. But do you think they're
beginning.
biased? I mean, one of the things that Nigel Farage said this morning was that because Lord Thomas is involved in a group that was working on trying to integrate UK and European law, that somehow that means he had a vested interest and he just shouldn't have made the judgment at all.
I mean, no, I don't think it's right to say that he shouldn't have been allowed to make it, and I think they acted in good faith. Obviously, all human beings bring prejudices and assumptions to everything, and that doesn't stop being true when you put a great horsehair wig on. We're all subject to the various things that have gone into it. And I think it is probably fair to say that our legal profession has been much more pro-European integration than the general population. After the referendum, there was a letter by more than 1,000 lawyers effectively telling the Prime Minister to disregard the referendum result. So I don't think it's controversial to observe that the judiciary is a more pro-EU constituency than the electorate as a whole. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have made this ruling. And we'll see what happens in the appeal.
And briefly, Daniel, Chris Patten said that he thinks you've got a better idea of what Brexit should mean
very flattering,
than Theresa May does.
I agree with that. Put me completely in charge of the whole thing. No, I mean, by the way, I also agree with what he said about Indian students. And I hope that one of the signals we will send very early that we are open to the world is that we should make it easier, not only for students from outside the EU, but also for skilled workers from outside the EU. We should say that if you're in a key industry, in the city, in pharmaceuticals, whatever, we should make it easier for you to give visas and work permits than under the current system. And that will signal that although we intend to control migration, we don't intend to screw the tap completely shut.
Now, I was quite struck that I think you did just say that you think Theresa May is some way from having a coherent Brexit plan, but we'll probably have a bit more of that.
No, I'd never say I'm a big fan of Theresa May. No, and I think, by the way, it's brilliant that she's going to India as her first major...
I get all that. So, we'll be back to you in a second, but just a quick word with Allegra.
Well, social media loved that Chris Patten interview, so did I. In particular, the political editor of The Times, Francis Elliott, pointing out Lord Patten says Sajid Javid should have been sacked for saying Article 50 judge is unacceptable, but there were loads of news lines out of that interview.
So let's begin today by talking about the row that's still burning brightly over the government's defeat at the High Court. The judge's decision over who can trigger Article 50 was criticised by a number of newspapers and some politicians, which in turn led to accusations that the government was failing to defend the principle of an independent judiciary. Well, one of the people who brought the court case, the investment manager Gina Miller, was on the Andrew Marr show earlier, talking with UKIP's interim leader, Nigel Farage.
I just want to ask her, what part of the word leave don't you understand?
This case, have you read the case?
Yes, and you're arguing
Yes.
that Parliament should have a say. But do you want us, ultimately, OK, you accept we're leaving the European Union, do you want us to stay part of the single market?
That is not. I'm not the politician. I'm not the politician here. I'm the person who saw the elephant in the room, which was there is no legal certainty. You should actually be my biggest fan because I've just created the legal certainty so that Theresa May can now, rather than appealing, go ahead, have the debate and leave.
Gina Miller and Nigel Farage there. Tim Shipman, this is essentially an argument about whether the High Court judges are legitimately upholding the sovereignty of Parliament or they're the enemies of the people. Who's winning the argument?
Well, at the moment, nobody's winning the argument because there's just a lot of heat on both sides. All this is really about is how you make triggering Article 50 happen legally. But people on both sides are trying to refight the referendum battles, it seems to me. It's fairly straightforward. Theresa May was never going to be able to get away without involving Parliament in some way in this process. This is now going to make her do that. And equally, Parliament was never going to be in a position where it's going to be able to override the referendum result because that's politically untenable. And the sooner both sides recognise both of those simple facts, the quicker we can move on.
But Polly Toynbee, is the High Court decision an example of elitist judges frustrating the will of the people?
I think you could say the High Court is an elite by definition. It's a kind of daft idea. What we've seen is an extraordinary attack by most of the right-wing press, enemies of the people, of three very distinguished High Court judges. And they've made the decision that the royal prerogative, the Prime Minister cannot on her own tear up treaties, tear up our rights to be European citizens, and Parliament, only Parliament has the authority. That's a legal decision, and it's now going to go to the Supreme Court. Nobody thinks that Parliament is not going to trigger Article 50. Of course it is. And so will the Lords too. I doubt if they will put their necks on the line and take a suicidal act of that kind.
Right. I mean, are you convinced by that, Toby Young? Because that's obviously the fear. The fear is that actually, despite what Polly Toynbee says, there will be attempts to lodge amendments, certainly in the Commons and the Lords, to try and somehow change or dictate the terms of the government's negotiating stance.
Yeah, I think the worry for those of us on the Leave side isn't that Parliament wouldn't ultimately vote to trigger Article 50, but as you say, the bill empowering Theresa May to do that might be amended and caveated in various ways. So it might say you're only allowed to trigger Article 50 if we remain full members of the single market.
But that's a parliamentary democracy, isn't it, Toby Young? I mean, isn't that the point, that actually the executive shouldn't have the powers to dictate, if you like?
I don't think there would be anything improper about Parliament trying to do that, though it would be ignoring the will of the British people. And I think in those circumstances, I think Theresa May would have no choice but to try and trigger a general election and make sure she had a larger majority in Parliament so she could empower herself effectively to trigger Article 50 without those caveats, which would render it almost meaningless.
Polly.
She might have to do that, but the point is the will of the people was for Brexit, and that's going to happen, and MPs and Lords will vote for it. What we don't know is on what terms. The next level is we want to see what the government's plan is as it enters negotiation. We don't want to know what its bottom line is. We want to know what its intent is. We want to know, should we stay in the single market? Should we stay in the customs union? The will of the people has not been expressed on those matters. That's the sort of thing that only a parliament can debate and discuss.
Right, Nigel Farage says, believe you me, if the people in this country think they're going to be cheated on the issue of Brexit, they're going to be betrayed, then we will see political anger, the likes of which none of us in our lifetimes have ever witnessed in this country. Does that sound like he's inciting some sort of action on the street?
Demagoguery, totally terrifying demagoguery, encouraged by people like the Daily Mail and the Sun well.
I certainly wouldn't endorse those remarks as a Leaver, but I think that what he says might become true if, let's suppose, the Supreme Court overturns the High Court's decision, which I think is more likely than not. But if the Supreme Court does that, and Gina Miller then tries to appeal the Supreme Court's decision in the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice then ruled overruling the Supreme Court's decision to overturn the High Court's verdict, then we could have a real constitutional crisis.
Well, I wonder if Theresa May has to herself go to the European Court, which she wants to...
Well, that really would be difficult for her, wouldn't it? Let's leave it there just for the moment. So, Theresa May has insisted this morning that she will be able to stick to her plan of lighting the Brexit touch paper in March next year. But thanks to that High Court judgment, she could face some serious fireworks as MPs and peers threaten to delay or even obstruct her plan. Ellie Price's report contains flashing images, lots of them.
Ah, bonfire night. That strange British tradition where we celebrate democracy by setting things on fire. It's the anniversary of Guy Fawkes wanting to do away with Parliament. Though worth also remembering, his main target was the King, the executive. Almost 411 years to the day later, it's Article 50 that's the burning issue in Westminster. Should it be MPs who authorise it, or the PM? It's the decision by the High Court that's got everyone in quite a spin.
Hello there.
It caught by surprise even those behind it.
It's not about how anyone voted. Every one of us voted for the best country and the best future. This case was about process, not politics.
For others, it was all about politics. The government immediately announced it would appeal the decision in the Supreme Court.
Mr. Speaker, the government is disappointed by the court's judgment. The country voted to leave the European Union in a referendum approved by Act of Parliament. The government is determined to respect the result of the referendum.
The next day, the decision was slammed in a number of damning headlines, and that led to the papers themselves feeling the heat of criticism. The Prime Minister, meanwhile, was quick to reassure European colleagues there was no problem. She'd still be able to trigger Article 50 and start exit negotiations by next March. But then, something else unexpected. The Conservative MP Stephen Phillips, a QC, resigned his seat in protest at the government's handling of Brexit so far. An explosive week, or so it seemed.
Actually, this is how the British Constitution gets made. We don't have a written constitution. What we have is a system where Parliament makes laws and the courts interpret those laws, and that's exactly what's happened this week.
And all of this was rather avoidable, wasn't it?
I think if the Referendum Act had made provision for what should happen at this stage, said once we've got an answer from the people, this is what then has to happen to give effect to that answer, then we wouldn't be in this situation, no.
One prominent Leave campaigner told me the wording, or lack of it, on the EU referendum bill had been David Cameron's last stitch-up. The government now accepts that if it loses its case in the Supreme Court, which many legal experts say it will have to draft legislation that will go through Parliament. And if it doesn't have enough support for that, well, Theresa May could choose to hold a snap general election. There are MPs, after all, who said they would, at the very least, seek to amend a bill, if not vote against it.
If the government were to pursue a very hard Brexit approach, which I judge and other MPs judge to be not in the national interest, then I would vote against that and say, go back to the drawing board, come up with a better approach to Brexit, and then bring it back to Parliament.
If you have the opportunity, because there will be a chance to amend the Article 50 legislation, would you attempt to insert into that a second referendum, which is the policy you stood on in the Labour Party once the negotiations are over?
Yes, I will.
All the Tory MPs I've spoken to say there's no appetite for a general election. And anyway, the majority of them know that they'd be toast if they got in the way of the will of their constituents.
The bigger worry, say a number of MPs, is the Lords, who don't have constituents and their vote to worry about. Several Leave-supporting Tory MPs have told the Sunday Politics the government should just get on with drafting legislation and dump the Supreme Court appeal. They may be warming to that idea. Senior government sources have told us one possibility is to bring forward a one-clause bill in the new year, get it through the Commons in a week, and dare the Lords to oppose it.
I'm joined now from our lead studio by the Shadow Justice Secretary, Richard Bergen. Welcome to the programme. You've attacked the government and criticised them for remaining silent after attacks on British judges in newspapers. Since when is it not OK to criticise judges?
Well, it's OK to disagree with the judgments of judges in cases. I had the benefit of being a lawyer for 10 years, and there were plenty of occasions where either I, if I was on the losing side in a case, or the other side, if they were on the losing side in a case, didn't agree or were disappointed with a judge's judgment. We wouldn't go running off to the papers to talk about the sexuality of the judge or call them enemies of the people. What's really important in a mature democracy is that the independence of the judiciary is respected. Indeed, the Lord Chancellor Liz Truss has her first statutory role set out in statute to protect and defend the independence of the judiciary.
Sure, but Richard Bergen, how has their independence been curtailed by criticism in the newspapers?
It has been suggested by the newspapers that it is some kind of liberal conspiracy against the will of the British people.
But it's an expression of free speech. I mean, newspapers say nasty things, rightly or wrongly, but say nasty things about the judiciary and judges' decisions almost every week.
And we all agree with and respect freedom of speech, but freedom
So
of
what's the
speech,
difference?
but freedom of speech, if you allow me to finish, and my freedom of speech as well, has to be respected but used responsibly. And when you see on the front page of a newspaper the faces of 3 judges with them being declared enemies of the people, that's not what happens in a mature democracy.
Right.
But my priority is not my priority is not just criticising the papers for doing that, which was completely immoral. It's also asking why the Lord Chancellor hasn't criticised the papers for calling judges the enemies of the people and for bringing the sexuality of a judge into this matter.
Right,
the
because they
judges,
don't tend to intervene. Ministers don't tend to intervene on the basis of front pages of newspapers. But as you say, you've criticised judges' decisions before when they haven't gone your way, as you were a lawyer. And Jeremy Corbyn has too, in fairly recent history. When Lord Justice Beatson ruled in the Court of Appeal that Labour had the right to block new members in the leadership contest between Owen Smith and Jeremy Corbyn, Mr Corbyn's team called the decision wrong, both legally and democratically. So you're not shy of criticising and being outspoken about the judiciary yourselves?
Well, saying you disagree with a judgment is very different from raising the sexuality of a judge or calling them the enemies of the people.
You said it was legally and democratically wrong.
I'd have expected any Lord Chancellor to speak out against that. In a mature democracy, however tempting the press and politicians find it, we shouldn't be giving a roasting to the judiciary. And, and the truth is, by the way, that the judges haven't blocked Brexit. This was a constitutional decision. Labour respects the result of the referendum. And I'll tell you, there's 2 things which are dangerous for our democracy. One is attacking the independence of the judiciary, and the other is trying to rub out or rerun a referendum.
Sure. Well, let's talk about Brexit and the negotiation. I mean, if the government brings forward a one-line bill to try and get this vote through quickly, will you try and amend that bill?
Well, we'll see what bill they bring forward, but Labour, the Labour position is not to block Article 50.
Right.
Article 50 needs to be triggered in order to start the process of leaving the European Union.
So
Britain should leave the European Union because Britain voted to leave the European Union.
You won't vote against triggering Article 50 in any circumstances, even if you lose amendments on things like protecting workers' rights?
Well, much of the discussion and much of the scrutiny will actually happen after Article 50 is triggered. But what we need from the government is a plan about what Britain would look like after leaving
you haven't answered my question, which is, would you vote against triggering Article 50 if Labour puts down an amendment, which I understand they will do, for protecting workers' rights? Would you still vote to trigger Article 50?
Labour won't be blocking the triggering of Article 50, but what we will be setting out is the fact that Britain needs a plan. We need to stop talking about the 48% who voted to remain and the 52% who voted to leave. We now start to need to talk about the 100% bringing people together and talking about what Britain post-Brexit looks like.
Sure.
We want to protect workers' rights, we want to protect environmental cooperation, we want to protect British jobs and access to the single market. These are all important things, and it's quite right, by the way, that an unelected Prime Minister, who wasn't even elected by her own MPs, doesn't get to do these things off her own back. Parliamentary scrutiny is required so that the will of the British people is done and done thoroughly and properly.
Right, and you've sort of raised indirectly the issue of calls for a general election in order for Theresa May to get some sort of mandate when it comes to Brexit negotiations. Now, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn was asked about his thoughts on a general election, and he didn't want to give an answer for some reason. Let's just have a look at what he had to say. Or not.
You'd be happy if Theresa May called a general election. Okay. He's not happy if she decided to call a general election.
Can we go outside? You're being harassed here.
I am a professional. If she wants to know what the leader of the opposition thinks about the possibility of a general election.
Richard Bergen, I know you couldn't see that, but you've probably heard it, where an ITV journalist asking Jeremy Corbyn just a fairly straightforward standard question about a general election and whether there should be one, and she was accused of harassing the Labour leader. What was wrong exactly with the question?
Well, I think, with respect, that's a bit of pre-prepared false controversy. Jeremy Corbyn has answered this question repeatedly, and what he said is...
But he didn't answer it then. He seemed to walk away, and as I say, it was a fairly standard question, and yet the journalist was told that she was being unprofessional and harassing the Labour leader. Is that because he doesn't want to talk about the possibility of a general election because of the state of the polls?
Well, you've defended the right of the press to attack the judiciary, raise their sexuality and call them enemies of the people, in effect. Let me now defend the right of Jeremy Corbyn on one question to walk up and give a speech he was due to give and do interviews afterwards. Jeremy Corbyn has answered this question repeatedly, including yesterday. He has said he's ready to fight a general election, whether that be this year, whether it be 2020. We've got the members, we've got the motivation, we've got the vision and the capacity to take the arguments to the British people. It really is a storm in a teacup. And no interview was meant to take place before he gave the speech because he was walking towards the stage to give a speech. I know that journalists may think they have the right to an audience whenever they wish, but there will have been hundreds of people in that room waiting for a speech at a specific time. Interviews were granted afterwards, interviews were granted before, and Jeremy had to go on and do his job. It's no mystery what Jeremy's views of a general election. He made it clear yesterday.
All right, well, it was surprising if it's not a mystery. I don't know why he didn't answer at the time, but viewers will make up their mind. Richard Bergen, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm joined now from our Glasgow studio by the Conservative peer Michael Forsyth. He served in John Major's cabinet. Welcome to the programme. As a former cabinet minister, how do you feel about high-ranking members of the Conservative government openly rounding on the independent judiciary?
Well, I'm not keen on people attacking the judiciary, and I think this is all a bit of a sideshow. I mean, if the government chooses to bring forward a one-clause bill which simply provides for Article 50 to be give notice of Article 50, it's highly unlikely that that is going to be amended in the Commons if the long title is written properly. And as you've just heard Richard say, I mean, there is no inclination on the part of the opposition to oppose Article 50, which is simply turning the starter on the process. It's not actually implementing Brexit. It's actually just initiating the process.
Right, but as you said at the beginning of your answer to my question about the judiciary, you're not in favour of openly criticising the judiciary in the way that has been done. But do you agree with the former Attorney General Dominic Grieve, who actually labelled these attacks on the judiciary as having something smacking of the fascist state about them?
I'm really surprised that Dominic, of all people, should use such inflammatory language. Look, the judges have made a decision. The government is going to appeal. What the government should now do is get on with drafting a tightly drawn clause to allow the process to start, which the people voted overwhelmingly for, which is to give notice that we wish to leave the European Union. The Prime Minister is absolutely right to say we are going to leave the European Union. And all of this manoeuvring by people, I mean, one of the advantages of the judgment is it's brought these people into the open who do not accept the results of the British people.
Right, but is it also a case of drawing out into the open those people who just don't like decisions that don't go their way, don't respect the independence of the judiciary, who, after all, were merely upholding Parliament's sovereign right to approve triggering Article 50 rather than the executive?
Well, I think there's a certain irony, isn't there, that they're arguing that the royal prerogative can't be used to take powers back to Parliament, but they've been very happy to see it being used over the last 30 years to give Parliament's powers away. So you can understand the controversy, but we need to get on. I mean, after all, many of the people who are on the Remain side were arguing that leaving the European Union would result in uncertainty. So the last thing we need is a further period of prolonged uncertainty.
Right.
And therefore I hope that Parliament will get on with the necessary process. If the Court of Appeal, if the Supreme Court overturns the judgment of the Court of Appeal, we can get on with it. Otherwise, the government should bring forward a one-clause bill and use the expedited process, not the emergency process, in order to get that through the House of Commons. And if it comes to the House of Lords unamended, there is no way the House of Lords is going to interfere with that.
Right, well, you say no way. What do you base that on? I mean, the Conservative peer, Baroness Wheatcroft, says the Lords will stall Brexit until we have a clearer idea of what it actually entails. And that's the Conservative peer, Baroness Wheatcroft, yes, a Remainer. But what do you say to her?
Well, Patience Wheatcroft is a very able lady. She's on the Economic Affairs Committee with me. Our committee have decided to look at some of the issues in a constructive manner. She has said from the beginning that she doesn't accept the result of the British people, and I'm afraid for an unelected peer to try and overturn the result of a referendum is just foolish.
But she's
and
not
I don't
saying
think
she's
she
going
will
to
find
overturn it. She's not going to overturn it,
Well,
as
she
her
started-
and many of her supporters, but what she wants to do, I mean, basically, as you know, Michael Forsyth, the referendum in their minds, in Patience Wheatcroft's mind, marked an exit from the EU, but not the manner in which the UK would exit the EU. And that's the argument they're now making.
But as soon as the result was announced, she said she was going to use the House of Lords and do everything possible to overturn it. Now she's talking about requiring more information, but the government has made the position absolutely clear on what the government's overall strategy is. We want to have access to the so-called single market. In the treaties, it's called the internal market, and people are arguing we should be in the internal market, and at the same time that they want to leave the EU are simply ridiculous.
Right, but access to the single market, as you know, is one of those phrases that can mean a myriad of things to a multitude of people.
Well, it means what it means. Every country in the world has access to the single market. The issue is what tariffs, if any, would be levied, and the government's position is perfectly clear, which is they wish to have free trade.
What would happen, do you think, if peers do attempt to, your colleagues attempt to, in a way, sort of frustrate the process so that they get some of the things that they would like to see added or put into the negotiating position by the government?
You mean colleagues in the Lords?
Yes.
Well, I mean, the Lords has a long-standing convention called the Salisbury Convention that we do not oppose matters which are in the manifesto.
But it wasn't in the manifesto,
No,
was it?
it's far more important than a manifesto commitment. This was a referendum result where we had the largest turnout ever of voters who voted clearly to leave the European Union, and the issue is whether we press the starter button,
right.
whether we just say we want a divorce. That's all that moving Article 50 means.
Right. Should Theresa May call a general election to strengthen her hand, strengthen her mandate, if the Supreme Court upholds the decision and actually allows a full Act of Parliament to go through the Commons and the Lords?
Well, when you say a full act of Parliament, all that my reading of the judgment, all it says is that Parliament must have a say on whether or not we're going to proceed with Article 50.
But should she call a general election to strengthen her hand?
I don't think it's necessary. I think the House of Commons would look ridiculous if it prevented the government beginning the first steps towards leaving the European Union after a referendum. And if the Commons sends an unamended bill to the Lords of course will debate it and they will discuss it, but it's unthinkable that they would reject it. And I think that people like Peston, Sweetcroft and others, Liberals in particular, who are arguing that it's possible for the House of Lords to overturn or delay this, are going to find themselves with very few friends in the House of Lords, which very well understands its own constitutional position.
All right.
The House of Lords is already doing excellent work in putting forward ideas, and that is its proper role.
Michael Forsyth, thank you.
Now, the government has said it will appeal against the High Court's decision to give Parliament a say over when Article 50 is invoked. So what happens now? Could the Supreme Court vote overturn the whole ruling? Well, I'm joined now from Stratford-upon-Avon, in actual fact, by Michael Mansfield. Very good to talk to you, Michael. First of all, your reaction to the reaction, so to speak, and if it does go to the Supreme Court and it is upheld there, do you think the government ought to say something, that it will abide by whatever decision they come to, and that really tabloids shouldn't criticise judges?
Well, firstly, I think I'm appalled by certain, well, I hesitate to call them newspapers, but the tabloids, in particular the Daily Mail. It's totally irresponsible, because the judges, whether you like them or you don't like them is beside the point. They are an independent arm of our state. They are there and they are entitled to pass judgment on questions of law, which is what they've just done. So I think that all that does is the flames of prejudice are fanned by that kind of headline. So that I'm very dismayed and disappointed that the government itself hasn't come out to defend the judiciary over this. Secondly, I think the government at this point should recognise that it's most unlikely that the Supreme Court are going to go, they could do, but to go against 3 extremely senior judges, including the Lord Chief Justice. It's possible, but most unlikely, because it was a unanimous judgment and a very clear judgment, almost saying we don't understand the argument here because we have parliamentary sovereignty and really everybody recognises that.
Of course, it could be appealed beyond that, couldn't it? Be rather ironic if it ended up in European Court.
Yeah, well, you're quite right. There is a European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, which deals with points of law or interpretation of European Union law. And I don't think, even if it got to the Supreme Court, that issues at the Supreme Court will invoke European law. So I think it's unlikely, but it would be ironical that it can get to the European Court.
Now, just tell us, the point of law here, and we want your expertise on this, Michael Mansfield. Lord Kerr, who was centrally involved in actually inserting Article 50 into the Lisbon Treaty, seems to have been saying that you actually could revoke it. You could untrigger it after having triggered it. And wasn't this what the whole case hinged on, that it was irrevocable?
Yeah, yes, I think in fact, from that point of view, because you've got parliamentary sovereignty, clearly the government, there are all sorts of things that are possible. I mean, the first thing is obviously this government, having triggered it next March, would then have to have had, before that happens, some form of legislation. That's what the court is saying. So between now and March, there'll have to be a statute or there'll have to be a piece of legislation. It's not very difficult to draft it, which authorises the government to trigger Article 50. However, having done that, obviously, one of the other things that May is thinking about is, well, let's have a general election, change the complexion of the House of Commons so that she can be sure that if there's a vote in relation to a statute being passed through to trigger Article 50, she'll win it clearly. I think that's one of the dangers she's worried about. But of course, future parliaments, because of parliamentary sovereignty, can undo everything. It's just, if you like, a protocol that successive governments don't do that because they recognise, well, they don't do it very often, because they recognise that it would be undermining parliamentary sovereignty, and in this case, seriously undermining the will of the British people. So I think, although it's possible, it's unlikely.
So do you think, taking all that on board, that Theresa May can stick to her timetable if, as she says, puts a fairly simple bill before the House of Commons, even if the Supreme Court uphold the decision, she could still trigger Article 50 by the end of March?
I think she could. And I think what I think is dismaying, if I can use that pun on the word, it really dismays everybody that this hadn't been thought through, probably by anyone. But even once Theresa May became Prime Minister, she must have known about the possibility of parliamentary sovereignty. I mean, she's a parliamentarian, and it seems to me they've got hundreds of lawyers who draft legislation. To draft an act which can be 2 lines, which authorises the government to trigger Article 50, that's all it does. It can focus on that in the autumn, and they probably at this stage, looking at the way the Labour Party and opposition parties are saying, we're not going to go against the British people on this one, so we're not going to block that vote. She'd have got it through by now, so she could easily have got it, and she can still do it, I think, by March the 17th, I think the date is.
Thank you very much indeed for your input there, Michael. Michael Mansfield there in Stratford-upon-Avon.
I've been getting away